The blast tore through the hull like a hot knife through wax. Metal screamed, lights died, and the hallway filled with a choking haze of smoke and dust. Commander Mark Bryson hit the wall hard, his shoulder slamming into a jagged edge that bit deep. He didn't scream. There wasn't time. He pushed off, staggered forward, then felt it warm, wet, pouring down his right side. He looked down. The tear in his uniform was wide enough to see the muscle underneath, sliced clean across the deltoid and trailing down. Blood ran down his arm, dripping from his fingertips. "Bryson?" A voice crackled through his calm, distorted and panicked. "Are you Commander? Are you hit?" He didn't answer. His lips were tight, jaw clenched. He wasn't wasting breath. The explosion had come from one of the auxiliary fuel lines near the forward cargo bay. He'd been inspecting the hull integrity with a joint crew, 3 humans, 4 from the Yelvani medical delegation, and something had overloaded. He didn't know if it had been sabotage or a malfunction or pure dumb luck, but it didn't matter now. Mark stumbled into the open medbay hatch, gripping his arm with his left hand. Blood was still pulsing from the wound, now soaking the floor in thin red puddles. The Yelvani inside, tall, pale blue creatures with 6 limbs and faces like veined marble froze. One of them, a medic named Ralish, stepped forward. "You are hemorrhaging. You must lie down immediately." "I'm not lying down," Mark said through his teeth. "Just give me the kit." Ralish hesitated. "You are not qualified to. I said give me the kit." There was a tense moment, then Ralish gestured to the surgical cart. "There. But you should not attempt." Mark didn't wait. He stepped to the cart, gritting his teeth as he tore the rest of his sleeve away and grabbed the antiseptic. The bottle trembled in his hand as he poured it over the wound. Pain lanced through his shoulder like fire. He exhaled sharply, eyes closed, but didn't stop. The Yelvani medics watched in stunned silence. One of them, a younger one named Tevin, whispered something in their native tongue. Ralish replied, "He is attempting self-surgery. This is not protocol. He is not stable." Mark didn't care about protocol. He grabbed the sterile gauze, pressed it hard against the open gash, and held it there with his chin while his good hand searched for the suture kit. When he found it, he exhaled again, this time slower. His fingers were slick with blood, but he managed to get the needle threaded. "Commander," Ralish said, stepping closer, "you must allow us to sedate you." "No sedation," Mark said. "I need to stay awake." "There might be another breach. You are in shock." "Then work faster." He began stitching. It wasn't clean. The angle was awkward. Every movement sent waves of pain shooting through his chest and neck, but he kept going, one stitch, then another. The needle slipped once, nicking the skin further, but he didn't even flinch. Ralish turned to the others. "He is in pain, but he continues." "Why?" Tevin asked. "Is this normal?" Ralish didn't answer. By the time Mark tied off the last suture, his hands were shaking. He reached for the adhesive bandage strips and sealed the wound as best as he could. Blood still oozed around the edges, but the worst of it had stopped. Then he sat back, breathing hard, sweat pouring down his face. Ralish moved forward again. "You require fluids and rest." Mark nodded. "Fine. Now I'll rest." He slumped onto the bench, letting his back hit the wall. His eyes fluttered shut for a second, but he forced them open. "Have someone check the cargo bay. If there's a leak in the antimatter line, we're dead." Tevin moved quickly to his comms. The others stayed still, watching Mark like he was some kind of anomaly. A bleeding, battered anomaly. 2 hours later, he was on a stretcher. The medics had finally insisted, and Mark had relented once he confirmed containment integrity was still holding. They ran scans, pumped him full of saline and antibiotics, and rechecked his stitching job in silence. Ralish finally spoke. "Your sutures are adequate." "Thanks," Mark muttered. "I practiced on pigs." Ralish blinked. "Pigs, earth animals, we use them for training. You know, for messy stuff. You should not have done it yourself. I didn't see any of you stepping in." Ralish folded his upper arms. "We were preparing proper procedure. You acted before we could intervene." Mark looked at him. "I was bleeding out. There are protocols for trauma triage, not when you're alone in the field." Ralish didn't respond to that. He turned away and began running another scan. The recovery took time. Mark wasn't allowed to return to duty for 5 days. The wound, though deep, hadn't hit anything vital beyond the muscle. The stitches held, and the tissue began knitting properly with the help of Yelvani cell repair gel. But he still had to change the dressing twice a day, and mobility in his right arm was limited. The Yelvani watched him constantly. Whenever he walked into the medbay, there was a pause. Conversations stopped. Heads turned. Even the ones who'd never seen him before seemed to recognize him. One afternoon, a Yelvani technician named Lenvin approached him while he was doing shoulder mobility exercises. "You do not appear." "Engineered for resilience," Lenvin said. "And yet you endured extreme physical damage with minimal support." Mark raised an eyebrow. "That's supposed to be a compliment. It is an observation. You possess no redundant organs, fragile skeletal structure. Yet your pain tolerance is abnormal." Mark grunted as he lifted a small resistance ball over his head. "Yeah, well, we adapt." Lenvin tilted his head. "We were taught humans are emotionally volatile, capable of irrational behavior. Sometimes we are. Then what you did." "Was that irrational?" Mark paused. "Probably, but it worked." Lenvin was quiet for a long moment. "We do not understand your kind." Mark tossed the ball into the crate beside him. "You don't have to. Just don't get in the way when we're bleeding out." The next day, the station commander called him in. "You scared the hell out of the medics," Commander Talon said, tapping a stylus on the datapad. "They filed a formal report." Mark stood straight. "I followed emergency field procedure. You stitched yourself shut in front of alien medics who have never seen a human do that. Because I was bleeding." "I'm not saying you were wrong," Talon said. "I'm saying you made an impression." Mark looked around the empty office. "Is that a problem?" Talon sighed. "No, but now the Yelvani are asking for a human physiology seminar." Mark blinked. "You're kidding." "They want to know how someone survives that kind of trauma without sedation. Or screaming." "I didn't scream because I was focused. That's what worries them." Mark ran a hand over his still sore shoulder. "Fine, I'll write something up. You'll give a talk tomorrow. Think of it as interspecies diplomacy." The next afternoon, Mark stood in front of a room full of Yelvani medics. A holographic projection of the human muscular system hovered in the air behind him. His arm was still in a soft brace, and he moved carefully, but he spoke clearly. "We don't have redundant organs," he said. "We don't have regenerative limbs or neuro-sync healing. We get hurt, we bleed, and we heal slow, but we're stubborn." He paused and looked around the room. "What I did wasn't smart, it wasn't brave, it was necessary." "That's the difference." Ralish raised a hand. "Why did you not wait for us to act?" "Because there were 6 of you and 1 of me, and I was the one bleeding." Tevin asked, "Would all humans act this way?" Mark shook his head. "No, some would panic, some would pass out, some would scream. But some of us, we've trained for it." There was a long silence. Then Ralish said, "You should not have done it." Mark nodded. "I know, but we are impressed." Mark smiled faintly. "I'll take it." After the seminar, Ralish approached him privately. "I now understand why your kind leads in frontier expeditions. Your bodies are inefficient, but your minds are relentless." Mark looked at him. "You ever get hurt in the field? Not like that. Someday you might. Then you'll understand why we train the way we do." Ralish considered that. "I hope not, but I will remember." A week later, Mark was cleared for full duty. The scar on his shoulder itched slightly under his uniform, a reminder of the day the medics saw a man bleed and stitch himself without flinching. He never brought it up again, but the Yelvani did. Quietly. With respect. And sometimes, when he walked into the medbay, someone would hand him the suture kit. Just in case. 3 days later, Mark was back in the gym, if the bare-bones rack of resistance bands and a floor mat behind engineering could be called that. He moved stiffly, favoring his right shoulder, but he was determined to rebuild its range. The dull ache from the healing tissue made every motion deliberate. He kept his breathing even. From the corridor, soft clicks echoed Yelvani footsteps. Two of them entered, both in technician robes rather than medical. One was tall and thin, eyes the color of moss. The other had a cluster of light pulse sensors affixed to his upper thorax, blinking in sync with his breathing. They lingered near the doorway. "You following me?" Mark said without turning. "We were told you resumed motion therapy," said the tall one. "Our engineers wish to observe your recovery as a biomechanical case study." Mark lowered the resistance band, letting it retract slowly. "You're engineers, not medics." "Correct," said the one with the sensors. "But your tissue endurance under self-administered trauma control has prompted cross-departmental interest." Mark gave them a sideways glance. "You want to watch me do shoulder rehab?" "Yes." "And record the micro-adjustments in your kinetic posture. You know this is just basic physical therapy, right? Nothing fancy." "That is what makes it compelling." He exhaled, wiped his forehead with the collar of his shirt, and picked up a weighted sphere the size of a melon. "Fine. Just don't breathe down my neck. We do not breathe through our necks." "Yeah, I figured." He resumed the exercise, lifting the sphere in slow arcs, each movement calculated to avoid stress on the stitched area. The Yelvani began murmuring observations to each other in quick syllables. Their tone wasn't mocking, just dispassionately fascinated. After a few minutes, Mark broke the silence. "Didn't think watching a sweaty human grunt through shoulder pain would be how you spent your afternoon." "We expected vocalization," said the sensor-laden one. "But not in the form of rhythmic grunts. Is this pain display or respiratory control?" "Bit of both," Mark said, moving into a wall press. "Keeps you from tensing up too much." The tall one stepped closer. "You do not utilize localized numbing agents. Not unless the pain's unbearable." "This isn't. You are actively engaging damaged musculature. Does that not jeopardize repair?" "Not if you know where the limits are. You push just enough to keep the tissue from locking up, not enough to tear it again." The engineers fell silent again, recording. Mark finished the set and dropped the sphere. His arm throbbed, but it was a manageable throb, like a warm warning rather than a siren. The door behind them opened with a pneumatic hiss. Ralish entered, carrying a portable analysis array. His gaze passed from Mark to the two engineers. "Why are you observing him during rehabilitation? He consents," said the tall one. Ralish turned to Mark. "You should be resting. This level of strain could disrupt the healing matrix." "I'm not doing anything reckless. You are exerting stress on a region with active collagen reconstruction." "Yeah, exactly why I've got to move it. Otherwise I'll end up with adhesions." Ralish looked at him for a moment, then at the engineers. "He should not be a specimen." "I'm right here," Mark said, stretching the arm across his chest. "Still a person." Ralish's secondary limbs folded together. "Human medical recovery appears to operate with contradiction. You injure, then provoke the injury further in order to heal. We call it rehab. That is not an intuitive process." "No, but neither is having 6 arms," Ralish blinked slowly. "We are not the ones in recovery." Mark sat on the edge of the bench. "You want to know what's really weird? It's not the pain, it's how you get used to it. I know it's there, but it's like background noise now. I can feel it, but it doesn't stop me from doing what I've got to do." The engineers made an excited note of that. Ralish looked less enthused. "Your species experiences nociception yet continues activity. This may result in compounded damage." "Sure. Or it results in faster adaptation." Ralish narrowed his gaze. "You gamble with your biology." Mark shrugged with his good shoulder. "We call it calculated risk." Later that cycle, back in the med bay, Mark sat on the diagnostic bed while a Yelvani assistant ran a circulatory scan. The blue-tinted lights above pulsed faintly, mimicking natural day cycles. The med bay smelled faintly of sterilized resin and citrus, a Yelvani antiseptic that seemed to cling to everything. "Hold still," said the assistant, her voice soft but firm. Her name was Vess. She hadn't spoken much before today. Mark complied. The scanner whirred softly as it passed over his torso. "You're not like the others," Vess said. "What others?" "The humans assigned to previous missions. They deferred all care decisions to medical staff." different training. I served in recon before this. We didn't always have medics on hand. She adjusted the scanner. Still, to open your own skin to close it again. That is not something we expect from sapients. Pain's just the nervous system's way of saying, pay attention, doesn't mean panic. She tilted her head as if considering that. Your biology is not optimized for redundancy, but your behavior compensates. He smiled faintly. That's the nicest way anyone's called me stubborn. The scanner beeped. She checked the readout. No signs of infection, hematoma is resolving, sutures held alignment. Told you I could stitch. She didn't respond to that. Instead, she asked, how did you learn where to cut? Field manuals. Practice. Wrong cuts cost time. I learned fast. And the first time you did it to yourself, he let out a long breath. Tore my calf open on a jagged rock during a drop in the Andes. No evac, no backup. Used a fishing hook and dental floss. Vess stared at him. That is not medical equipment. It was what I had in the kit. She looked down at the scanner, then back at him. What kind of species prepares for surgery with fishing supplies, the kind that plans for the worst? She ran a cooling wand over the scar tissue. You should write a field document, something others can study. I'll think about it. Don't think too long. The engineers submitted a requisition for your rehab data. He raised an eyebrow. You're kidding. They attached a hypothesis. Human durability correlates with behavioral unpredictability. He almost laughed. That sounds about right. Later, as Mark left the medbay, he passed Tevin in the corridor. The younger Yelvani held a datapad and gave a quick nod. You are becoming a case model, Tevin said without looking up. Because I didn't die. Because you did not behave like a patient. Mark glanced around. The corridor was quiet except for the soft hum of life support systems. You ever break anything? He asked. Tevin hesitated. A sensory limb, once. During training, it was repaired in a nutrient bath. No pain. Yes, but it was controlled. Next time you're hurt, try doing it without the bath. That would be unnecessary. Yeah, that's the point. Tevin looked up from his datapad. Do humans always test limits this way? Only when we don't like the alternatives. He walked away, shoulder tight but moving. Behind him, Tevin stood still for a long while, the datapad forgotten in his hand. The hydroponics bay wasn't meant for lectures, but it was the only section large enough to hold the Yelvani engineering team, half the medical corps, and a handful of curious crew members from both species. Mark stood near a row of flowering oxygen moss with his right arm finally free of the brace. The air was thick with plant humidity and a faint citrus tang that clung stubbornly to Yelvani surfaces. We're not built for perfection, he said, carefully rotating his shoulder in a demonstration arc. So we plan for failure. Every field kit, every training module, it's not about having the best tools. It's about knowing what to do when none of them work. Several Yelvani recorded his movements, their ocular nodes blinking in pattern. One of them, dressed in a muted gray technician wrap, tilted his head. Why not design redundant systems into your biology? It would reduce the need for such improvisation. Because we didn't evolve that way, Mark replied. We evolved to survive long enough to keep going, not elegantly, just effectively. Another Yelvani raised a limb. You used metal hooks and thread to close a wound in the field. Is there no concern for contamination? Of course there is. But when your options are contamination or bleed out on a mountainside, you pick the one that buys you time. Then you deal with the rest later. The technician's limbs tightened slightly, a Yelvani sign of discomfort. That is an unacceptable risk under our standards. It was unacceptable to me too, but I didn't have the luxury of standards. I had a broken radio, a storm rolling in, and a leg that wouldn't stop leaking. Murmurs followed, not of judgment, more like recalibration. Mark could see it happening in real time. They weren't just absorbing facts, they were adjusting frameworks. He took a step forward. This isn't about how tough we are, it's about how flexible we are. You put us somewhere hostile and we'll figure out how to keep moving. Even if it hurts, especially if it hurts. One of the younger medics, smaller and with a shimmer to his facial ridges, lowered his notepad. Is that why human surgeons still use their hands instead of full automation? Sometimes, yeah, machines are great until they fail. Hands don't glitch, they tremble sure, but they don't crash when the power cuts out. From the back of the room, Ralish stepped forward. He didn't carry a scanner or a report this time, just his own presence, more deliberate than usual. You demonstrated unnecessary self-harm under crisis conditions, he said. But we have reviewed all telemetry. Your actions directly prevented systemic failure of the cargo bay containment. You were correct to remain conscious. I wasn't trying to prove anything. Nevertheless, you did. Mark leaned against the moss basin, careful not to crush any of the delicate stems. I didn't enjoy it, if that's what you're wondering. We did not assume enjoyment. But we do question a choice made to endure pain rather than delegate. I would have delegated in a heartbeat, but there was no one else who knew the containment systems and could move fast enough. Bleeding or not, I had to be the one. Ralish stood still. Would you do it again? In a second. Silence followed. Then Ralish turned to the rest of the group. The human model of resilience is not based on physiological durability. It is rooted in decision-making. It does not wait for ideal conditions. A Yelvani engineer tapped the side of his datapad. This principle could be applied beyond medicine, emergency protocols, disaster response modeling. You might want to leave out the fishing hook part, Mark said. That is the most compelling portion, the engineer replied without irony. After the session, the crowd thinned. Most of the medics filed out through the bay's side access, whispering in tight clusters. Mark stayed behind, stretching his arm slowly against the basin's edge, testing the upper limit of pain. Ralish remained near the entrance, watching him. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Ralish said, "We have added your case to our crisis response algorithms. Human methodology will be included in the next joint simulation." "Glad to be your worst-case scenario," Mark muttered. "You are not a worst case," Ralish said. "You are an alternate model." Mark straightened. "That's supposed to be a compliment," Ralish considered. "It is not intended as insult." They left the bay together, walking the corridor in companionable quiet. There was no applause, no ceremonial ribbon, just the hum of systems and the occasional flicker of overhead lights. 3 days later, Mark returned to the medbay not as a patient, but as a guest. A new integration exercise was underway. Yelvani and human personnel were paired up, each demonstrating emergency techniques from their own species. Mark was assigned to observe rather than participate. Tevin approached him during a break, holding up a Yelvani surgical stabilizer, an elegant device shaped like a crescent. "This stops arterial bleeds using pressure resonance," Tevin explained. "It calibrates to the vascular density of the patient." "Looks efficient," Mark said. "What do you use when the stabilizer breaks?" Tevin hesitated. "There is no designated substitute." Mark pulled a small rubber strap from his pocket and handed it over. "Tourniquet, manual, works on anything with limbs and blood." Tevin turned it over in his hands. "This is just elastic. That's the point. It doesn't need calibration. You tighten it until the bleeding stops. Then you deal with the consequences later." Tevin looked up. "This is extremely inelegant." "Yeah. It works, though." Later, while reviewing simulation results, Ralish approached the board where Mark was noting down comparative recovery times. "I have reconsidered your approach," Ralish said. "Your methods are not replicable across species." "But they are instructive. We're not asking you to copy us." "No," Ralish agreed, "but understanding your thresholds may help recalibrate ours." Mark finished noting the last data point. "Then I guess bleeding on your floor wasn't a total waste." Ralish looked at the chart. "It was a beginning." By the end of the week, a new section was added to the Yelvani Emergency Training Manual. It was short, practical, and appended with a human advisory. "In absence of optimal conditions, survival depends not on perfection but persistence." Beneath it, a footnote. "See Commander M. Bryson, Case Study 17B. Mark never brought it up again. He didn't need to. The scar on his shoulder faded. The memory didn't. Neither did the quiet ripple it left behind, somewhere between a misunderstanding and a new standard. And when the next drill sounded and the bulkhead doors sealed, the Yelvani didn't wait for protocol. They asked instead, what would the human do? And then they moved.